It's a strange place to be when technically you've died 3 times and returned with only 1% chance of survival.
Jim Lee has been taking photographs for 50 years. He's best known for his iconic fashion images from the 1960s and 70s when he worked with the likes of Yves Saint Laurent, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones.
Jim was a sort of missing link between the work of the 60s and that of the 70s. His strength is using colour and movement in a very powerful way. There's always a supercharging narrative in his work. It's highly theatrical and very gripping.
My father was in the spy business, which I didn't know until many years later. I grew up in a slightly stifling atmosphere of privilege and secrecy.
My only escape was visiting an old man called Albert, who lived very simply.
Well, Albert was a wonderful getaway. He lived in a little shack at the bottom of the drive. Turned out later, actually, my father owned the land, in fact. Anyway, Albert built this little house. The walls stopped about 6 inches from the ground. When it rained, the water just comes straight through when he's in bed, whether he's sitting in the chair or whatever. And his life was so simple and such fun. I gravitated more towards that than I did, the kind of life I was being brought up in.
So my dream of being a cowboy was born, except that America wouldn't have me because I was too young, so I went to Australia instead.
He did all these picaresque things that people do. Drove one of those great trucks across the Red Desert with an Aborigine. By night, he was getting into Sydney's Bohemia.
I got the saddle from the shop and I walked out thinking this is the best thing that ever happened, so I'm not going to go to the bush and become a cowboy. And so I picked up a lift from an extremely larger than average Aboriginal actually. He had this truck with about 4 or 5 trailers in the back with cattle. And he said, "What's with the saddle, boy?" And I said, "Well, I want to go out there and be a stockman, work on a ranch or be a cowboy." And he said, "Haven't you got the wrong country?" He said, "Well, if you come on this ride, you're going to have to be my cabbie's mate. So what we'll have to do is when I need a bit of a rest, I'll get in the back here and you'll stay there." And I sort of looked, well, I can't drive. I've never driven one of these before. He said, "I'll put a brick on the accelerator, put a block of wood across the steering wheel, and you just keep looking straight out there. And if you see something coming, give me a nudge or, we'll steer out the way." I said, anyway, so Gordon piled in the back. And the first thing he did was to cool himself down. He had a 6-pack of beer and he pulled all 6 rings with 2 hands and just did this, like that. Sort of cool himself down a bit. I thought, I better behave myself. I could see we've got a real animal, I sort of looked straight ahead and I was sort of looking in the mirror, looking in the back, and I could hear the sort of murmuring, and I could see him flicking through a dirty magazine, and he sort of like this. And I thought, hang on a second. And he went, he slammed the window, and the gob went out the window past and on the mirror, and went ding, dong, ding. I thought, we're in for a good ride here. Yes. He took me out to one of his family sort of villages, and I really couldn't ride a horse to save my life. I loved the idea, but I'd never done it before. And so I had this saddle. I said, "It's a horse saddle, trying to do this, not make a fool of myself." And I got on, and then the saddle went round the other way, and I fell off it. And eventually I got on and stayed on, gave it a kick, and it wouldn't move, and kicked it again and was thrown off. And then I got back on again, and eventually I did a bit of riding. And by the time I'd done that and got cheers from the Aboriginal family, it was time to set off and go on again. I'd completely forgotten about my saddle. I left it there and went off without the saddle. So the cowboy dream was over.
It really was. It was a line that was drawn underneath.
Exorcise the dream.
You very quickly become one of the photographers with a particular eye. There's a sense of a story. Something has just happened or might be about to happen.
I came back when I was 19. I went down to my family home for a weekend. We sat down at the table for lunch, and my father said, "Now, James, you can't go to Russia. You just can't do that." And I said, "Well, how do you know I'm going to Russia? I haven't told you yet. You seem to know more about my life than I know about myself." I said, "There's so many things that perplex me about you and your job and what you do and how you know all this stuff." I said, "I don't know what it is you do, but I can only think of 2 things, which it could be, one, you could run a brothel, or else you could be a spy." And he looked at me and he smiled and he said, "The latter." And I thought, what's that mean? The latter. Is that a brothel keeper or is he a spy? And after a little time I realized he was in the spy business.
I met Anna Wintour when she was the assistant fashion editor at Harper's & Queen. We ended up doing lots of work together. When she wasn't given the opportunity to take over at Harper's & Queen, Anna stormed off to New York at that time, and I went off too. That's when I did the big boxing series in New York with her. Directing TV ads in the 80s was quite different experience as it is now. The film directors of TV ads were much more free to be extravagant with our ideas. We had more creative control and the budgets were far greater. In those days, people would look forward to the TV breaks almost as much as the programs, and in some cases even more. At times, advertising agencies would give us a blank piece of paper and say, "This is the vague brief. You write the script. Do what you want. We love what you do." And we used to get away with murder. It was Tony Scott who told me that your second film is your hardest. The first one was hard enough. The second wasn't so easy, and of course life was very complicated at that point. I went through a divorce. I had health issues, had a couple of accidents and so on. The most tragic event of death I've ever encountered is the loss of my son.
That day when I went for a walk with the dog, and Pawsey suddenly picked up a rabbit and shook it and killed it. It was a little baby rabbit. And I thought, that's very unlike him. He's not like that normally. I went really strange too, and I kind of thought, poor little rabbit, and the dog ran off. And I kind of dug a little patch of soil up on the ground, and I cut across there and buried the rabbit, put the rabbit down under the soil, and walked on and felt very strange, actually. I didn't know why I did it. I couldn't understand what was going on. And then that night when I got back home, there was a knock at the door at 10 o'clock at night when I got back to London, and I was told by the police that he died in the car accident. But it's exactly the same time.
My photography has been influenced, and my film perhaps even more. In the film I did, Losing Track, there was a scene in it where a young boy had to go to his mother's funeral, and I put the scene in that film almost replicating what I had to go through when I buried my own son. It was cathartic. Every day that I have is a day extra. The photos I have shot more recently have been statements that I feel are the outrageous ones I still have to make. Oddly enough, I feel I have never been happier and live day to day as it comes.